Tonight I am reading Chapter 2, A Bengali in America. This is the book Banker to the Poor, Microlending and the Battle Against World Poverty. This is New York Times bestseller book written by Muhammad Yunus. Chapter 2, A Bengali in America. I have always thought of myself as a teacher. Even as a child, I loved instructing my younger brothers and insisted that they get only top grades in school. Immediately out of college, at the age of 21, I was offered a post as a teacher of economics in my old college at Chittagong. The college, established by the British in 1836, was one of the most highly respected in the subcontinent. I taught there from 1961 until 1965. During this time, I also tried my hand at private business. I had noticed that packaged materials tended to be imported from western Pakistan and that we in the eastern half of the country had no facilities to produce boxes or wrapping material. I persuaded my father to allow me to set up a packaging and printing plant. I prepared the project proposal and applied for a loan from the government-owned industrial bank. At that time, very few Bengali entrepreneurs wanted to set up industrial units. Our loan was immediately approved. I quickly set up a packaging and printing plant which employed 100 workers. Over time, it turned out to be a successful project, making a healthy yearly profit. My father, who was the chairman of the board, was extremely reluctant to have the company borrow from a bank. The whole notion of commercial credit made him so nervous that he made me pay the loan back early. We were probably one of the only startup businesses in Bangladesh at the time that repaid a loan before it was due. The bank immediately offered us an additional 10 million taka loan to set up a paper plant, but my father would not hear of it. The center of the packaging industry was in Lahore, West Pakistan, but as a nationalist Bengali, I knew we could manufacture our products cheaper in East Pakistan. Our products included cigarette packages, boxes, cartoons, cosmetic boxes, cards, calendars, and books. Earning money had never been a worry of mine, but the success of the packaging factory convinced my family and me that I could excel in business if I wanted to. Despite my success, I still wanted to study and teach. So when I was offered a Fulbright scholarship in 1965, I jumped at the chance to get a PhD in the United States. This would be my third trip abroad. As a Boy Scout, I had gone to the World Jamboree in Niagara Falls, Canada in 1955 and to Japan and the Philippines in 1959. But this time I was on my own and I was in for some surprises. At first, the University of Colorado campus in Boulder was quite a shock. In Bangladesh, students would never dare to call professors by their first names. If one spoke to Sir, it was only after being invited by Sir to speak, and then one spoke in enormously respectful terms. But in Boulder, teachers seemed to consider themselves friends of the students. I often saw faculty and students sprawled out on the lawn barefoot, sharing food, joking, and chatting. Such familiarity was totally unthinkable in Bangladesh. And as for the young codes in Colorado, well, I was so shy and embarrassed I did not know where to look. At Chittagong College, female students were distinctly in the minority. Of a student body of 800, no more than 150 were women. Women were also segregated. They were usually confined to the women's common room, which was off limits to male students. Their participation in the student politics and in other activities was limited. When we staged plays, for example, women were not allowed to participate, so men wearing women's dress and makeup would take on female roles. My female students at Chittagong University were extremely shy. When it was time for class, they would huddle in a group just outside the teacher's common room and then follow me to class, clutching their books and looking down at their feet so as to avoid the stares of the boys. Inside the classroom, they sat apart from the boys, and I learned to avoid asking them questions that could possibly embarrass them in front of their classmates. I never talked to them outside the classroom. In fact, I myself was so shy about women that I tried to ignore them entirely. Imagine my dismay when I arrived in the United States in the summer of 1965. The campus was alive with rock music. Girls would sit on the lawn with their shoes off, sunning themselves and laughing. I was so nervous I tried not to even look at them, but I still loved to sit in the student center watching the students come and go, chatting, flirting, eating, wearing their crazy clothes. The youth of the United States looked so strong and healthy and full of vitality. It was an age of drug experimentation. Alcohol was rife, but my shy personality led me away from the raucous parties. Raucous parties. I preferred to study in my room or watch TV. Television had appeared in Dhaka only in 1964, and before arriving in the United States, I was quite unfamiliar with it. At Boulder, I soon became addicted. My favorite show was 60 Minutes, but I also watched every silly sitcom there was. I Love Lucy, Gilligan's Island, Hogan's Heroes. I found I could talk and think more clearly when the TV was on. That is still true today. This was also the height of the Vietnam War, and along with other foreign students, I joined anti-war rallies and protest marches. Though I voiced my opposition to the Vietnam War, I tried to keep an open mind and not merely to spout what was fashionable or veer into groupthink. My leftist Bengali friends could not understand my positive opinions about the United States. Back in Dhaka, there was a lot of anti American sentiment. Students on every campus called the United States dirty capitalists, shouting, Yankee, go home. Quickly, I learned to enjoy the personal freedom of the United States. I started having fun. My studies were going well, and I even found time to learn square dancing. I got quite used to seeing people drinking wine, beer, and strong alcohol. Little everyday incidents made a great impression on me. I'll never forget the first time I entered a restaurant in Boulder to have the waitress say, "Hi, my name is Cheryl," and offer me a big smile and a glass of water with lots of ice in it. No one in my country or in South Asia would ever treat a stranger so openly and forthrightingly. Forthrightly. Forthrightly. As for American food, I missed my mother's spicy cooking. As much as I liked French fries, hamburgers, potato chips, and ketchup, I was heartily bored with American food, and I would have given anything in the world to eat rice and dal. or Bengali sweetmeats. My summer in Boulder, surrounded by students from many different countries and a beautiful sunlit campus, passed all too quickly. In the fall, my scholarship required me to attend Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, where I had a completely different experience. Nashville was depressing and unattractive after the wide open vistas of Colorado. Also, Vanderbilt had only recently been desegregated. Even the tiny restaurant I frequented, the Campus Grill, had been for whites only 6 months earlier. There were few foreign students and no Bengalis. I felt lonely and homesick. The winter was cold, and my dormitory, Wesley Hall, was so smelly that we quickly renamed it Wesley Hell. The heating pipes banged and knocked all night long. The showers had old-fashioned open stalls, and I was so shy and prudish that I took to showering in a lungi, a full-length skirt worn by people in Bangladesh. I was the only Fulbright scholar at Vanderbilt that year. At first, my classes bored me. My graduate program in economic development was a light master's superficial compared to the far more advanced work I had already done in Bangladesh. Luckily, however, I was soon placed on a PhD track and fell under the wing of a famous Romanian professor by the name of Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen. Professor Georgescu-Roegen was known as a terror on campus. He flunked many students, and it was rumored that he ruined many students' academic careers. But I thought he was wonderful. He taught me simple lessons that I never forgot, and precise economic models that would eventually help me build up Grameen. Through him, I realized there was little need for memorizing economic formulas. Far more important was to understand the underlying concepts that drive them to work. He also taught me that things are never as complicated as they seem. It is only our arrogance that prompts us to find unnecessarily complicated answers to simple problems. Wow. When I left for my Fulbright scholarship in the United States, I certainly had no intention of finding an American wife. I assumed that if and when the issue of marriage arose, I would marry the way everybody around me had, by arranged marriage. I also had no experience of women and was terribly shy around them. Bengalis are quite prudish and conservative in general, and even more so in the religious Chittagong district where I grew up. In my family, we never discussed such intimate things openly. So, in 1967, when a beautiful girl with shoulder length red hair and blue eyes approached me in the Vanderbilt library, I was completely unprepared. She asked me where I was from. Pakistan, I replied rather nervously. This girl was friendly, spontaneous, and particularly curious about me and my background. Her name was Vera Forostenko, and she was doing her master's work in Russian literature. Vera was born in the USSR, but she and her family came to the United States soon after the Second World War. They settled in Trenton, New Jersey. I liked her immediately. 2 years after we met, in 1969, Vera left Tennessee and moved back to New Jersey. I was already making plans to return to Bangladesh. I want to come live with you, dear, Vera said. You can't, I replied. I was extremely stubborn. It's a tropical country, A different culture. Women there are not treated as they are here. But I'll adapt, she insisted. She kept writing to me and calling to discuss this issue. Every time I found a reason why such a move would not work, she would find a counter reason. Finally, I changed my mind. We were married in 1970 and moved to Murfreesboro, a town 50 miles south of Nashville, where I was teaching at Middle Tennessee State University. Life was calm and peaceful. And then on March 25th, 1971, I came back to my apartment to have lunch and turned on the radio for the latest news from Dhaka. There was a brief item stating that the Pakistani army had moved in to block all political opposition against the government of Pakistan and that Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, leader of the independent movement, had fled. I was changing my clothes. I stopped, rushed to the phone, and dialed Dr. Jilur Rahman at her in Nashville. I asked him to turn on the radio and contact all the other Bengalis he knew in the area. Within an hour, I was at Jilur's house. At that time, there were 6 Bengalis from East Pakistan in Greater Nashville. We began collecting news from all sources. There was no obvious consensus on the situation, but one thing was clear. The Pakistani army wanted to crush Bengalis once and for all. One of us, a supporter of the conservative pro-Islamic Jamaat party, kept saying, "We really don't know what has happened. Let us wait for more details." I did not agree. "We have all the details we need," I said. "Bangladesh has declared its independence. We now have to decide whether we consider ourselves citizens of this new country or not. Everybody has the right to choose. I declare my choice. My choice is Bangladesh. I declare my allegiance to Bangladesh. If there is anyone else who would like to join me in this, he is free to do so. Those who do not join Bangladesh, I will consider Pakistani and an enemy of my country." There was silence. Everyone was taken aback by the way I posed the question of allegiance. I suggested that we form the Bangladesh Citizens Committee and immediately issue a press release for the Nashville print and electronic media. We decided 3 things. 1. We would try to meet all the news reporters of the local TV stations and the editors of the local dailies to explain our decision and to seek support for the Bangladesh cause. 2. We would each immediately donate $1,000 to create a fund for the struggle. 3. We would give 10% of our monthly salary to the fund until Bangladesh became independent. If needed, we would increase the percentage. Everybody pulled out his checkbook or borrowed from others to make the first deposit. The next day, March 27, we made appointments with local TV stations and newspapers. I was elected secretary of the Bangladesh Citizens Committee and spokesperson for the group. The local TV stations were thrilled. They rarely got a chance to scoop international news stories, and for them, we represented a red-hot international news break with the local angel. I was a teacher in a local university. The other 5 were medical doctors in city hospitals, and here we were, declaring ourselves citizens of a country not yet born. That afternoon, we reassembled at Jilur's house to watch the local evening news. My interview was telecast in full. The interviewer asked, "Do you have a message for the Tennesseans?" "Yes, I do," I replied. Please write to your congressional representatives and senators immediately to stop military aid to Pakistan. Your arms and ammunitions are being used to kill innocent, unarmed civilians of Bangladesh. Please ask your president to put pressure on Pakistan to stop genocide in Bangladesh. I was pleased that all six of us from different political tendencies and socio-economic backgrounds had cooperated with immediate action. We now wanted to know what other Bengalis around the United States were doing. We decided to contact Mr. Enayat Karim, a Bengali official in the Pakistan embassy. He gave me some important news. There would be a demonstration against the Pakistan Army's crackdown on civilians on March 29 on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. The biggest group of Bengalis would come from New York. He urged us to join. Though my doctor friends could not go because of their responsibilities at the hospitals, I announced that I would leave the next day. It was decided that I would go at my own expense. I could also use the 6,000 we had already raised if there was need for it in Washington. Where would I stay in Washington? I did not know anybody. Though I had never met Enayat Karim, he sounded like a friendly person. Why not try him? I called him again. I proposed to be his guest the next day. Would he mind? He immediately told me to come right over. His hospitality surprised me. I suppose the crisis had brought all us Bengalis together. Until midnight, we monitored every single radio station on Jildur's giant shortwave radio. Between news items, we ate delicious food supplied by Jildur's American wife, Joanne, and speculated on what might have happened to Sheikh Mujib. Finally, the news came that he had been arrested at Chittagong railway station while he was fleeing from the army. He was actually arrested at his house in Dhaka. We were in tears on hearing the news. All our fantasies of Sheikh Mujib leading the nation to victory were dashed. What would the Pakistani army do with him? Bring him back to Dhaka and execute him by firing a squad? Hang him? Torture him to death? I left for Washington, D.C. in the early hours of March 28, arriving at Enayat Karim's beautiful house in the late afternoon. Mistress Karim, who was also a native of Chittagong, welcomed me warmly. It was a busy day. The telephone never stopped ringing. Some calls were local, others from far-flung Pakistani embassies or from Bengali officials searching for policy guidelines. Thrown into the midst of this excitement, I felt like part of an already independent Bangladesh. There was no trace of Pakistan in the minds of those in the Karim household. While enjoying this intoxicating scene, I noticed a serious-looking man busy writing. He was Mr. S.A. Karim, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Pakistan at the United Nations, who had arrived from New York that morning. Eventually, he wanted to read aloud what he had written. Everyone gathered around him. He had just finished drafting an appeal to all heads of governments to put pressure on Pakistan to stop the genocide in Bangladesh. I did not want the demonstration to be a poor show and kept trying to find out who was in charge of the next day's activities on the Hill. What preparations were being made? Was somebody preparing posters to hold up in front of the TV cameras? Nobody in Enayat Karim's house seemed to know. I thought I should take some initiative. I went to a department store and bought stacks of colored paper, paint, and brushes. Immediately I set to work making festoons, a skill I had acquired while a student at Chittagong College. Shamsul Bari arrived. He was teaching Bangla at the University of Chicago. I had known him from a distance during our university days in Dhaka. The War of Liberation brought us close. We worked together during the entire period of the war. By evening, more people had assembled at Enayat Karim's house, some worried about their families in Bangladesh, others wanted more information about the situation in Dhaka and what needed to be done. The night was spent analyzing the situation and deciding on the strategy for the following day. First, delivering an appeal to all embassies and heads of government, and second, organizing the demonstration on Capitol Hill. Mistress Karim treated us as if we were her dearest friends, feeding us steaming plates of food while alternately cursing the Pakistani army and reciting Tagore poems. The next morning, March 29, I woke up to shouting. I threw on some clothes and ran down to the anteroom, where a short, skinny person with a beard was lecturing Karim in a loud voice. The small room was packed with 5 or 6 people. The tiny man was behaving very rudely. He kept accusing Karim and the other embassy officials of being traitors. The rest of the people in the room wore buttons printed with Bangladesh in bold letters. These visitors had driven from Harvard and other institutions in Boston to join the demonstration on Capitol Hill, and they were furious when they discovered that Bengali embassy officials had decided not to participate. The tiny man, Dr. Mohiuddin Alamgir, a fresh PhD from Harvard, who became one of my closest friends, spared no harsh words in attacking Karim. I tried to defend my host, explaining that embassy officials had contacts with the high officials in the US State Department who could brief them on the real situation. It was a good strategy to keep our high positions in the government so that the Pakistanis would not freely wield the power of the government against the Bengalis in East Pakistan. Alamgir disagreed. This was only sweet talk by cowards who did not want to join the cause of liberation but protect their cushy lifestyle. The meeting ended in a stalemate. Only on August 4 did Bengali diplomats of the Pakistan embassy finally defect and join the Bangladesh government in exile. That afternoon, we all gathered at the steps of the US Congress to demonstrate. Bengalis came from distant places. Washington, New York, and Detroit had the biggest contingents. I was particularly surprised to see so many Detroit factory workers who were from Sylhet district in Bangladesh. Nobody knew quite what to do or where to go. We could not begin because we did not have official permission to demonstrate. We were still wondering how to organize ourselves when Shamsul Bari showed up with the necessary permission. I shouted at the top of my voice, "Here is our leader. Let's now line up behind him and start our demonstration." It worked like magic. The demonstration on the steps of Capitol Hill was a grand affair. We were noticed by the US legislators. Congressional aides took time to be briefed on the situation and our demands. The news media were especially active. Television cameras covered the rally and took on the spot interviews. That evening, we all met at the residence of another official of the embassy, Mr. A.M.A. Muhit, the economic counselor. There was a heated debate over the coordination of Bengali activities in the United States and the immediate transfer of allegiance by Bengali diplomats. The shouting with which my day had begun was repeated with more intensity at this grand assembly, Why were not Bengali diplomats leaving the Pakistan embassy right away? We left after dinner, knowing that we had to find a way to coordinate the activities of all Bengalis in the United States, and convinced that the Bengali diplomats could no longer provide the necessary leadership. I began to doubt whether diplomats should stay on with Pakistan. On March 30, Shamsul Bari and I were given the responsibility of visiting all the embassies, meeting the ambassadors or their representatives, explaining our cause, and requesting recognition of Bangladesh as an independent state. It was a very interesting experience. We visited many embassies in one day. Each one had its own style of receiving us, but there were many common questions. Whom do you represent? Do you have a US based organization? How can we recognize your country if you do not have a government? Is there any foreign government supporting you? What is the position of your diplomats in the United States? Are they supporting you? When are they going to come out in the open? What proportion of the population in East Pakistan wants an independent Bangladesh? Only one question stumped us. Do you have a government of your own? Barry and I decided that we had to have our own government immediately. But how does one go about establishing a government in Bangladesh while still in Washington? I had an idea. I could fly to Kolkata, find a few people to form a cabinet, and announce to the world that a Bangladesh government had been formed. In a snap, we would have both the country and the government. Barry liked the idea. We decided I would leave for Kolkata the next day. I thought of another essential strategy, a radio station to broadcast programs for Bangladesh so that the people inside Bangladesh knew what was going on and what they had to do. A radio transmitter, I thought, should be mounted on a vehicle. I should broadcast inside Bangladeshi territory and return to the Indian side of the border whenever chased by the Pakistani army. I had $6,000. This should cover the down payment for a transmitter. We had some special requests for various embassies. At the Burmese embassy, we asked Burma to keep its borders open to those fleeing from the Pakistani army. We would try to find funds to feed refugees from Bangladesh. At the Sri Lankan embassy, we asked Sri Lanka to refuse lending rights to all Pakistani military and civilian fights between Bangladesh and Pakistan. Pakistan was known to carry personnel, arms, and ammunition of civilian flights from Karachi to Dhaka. In the Indian embassy, we were treated like highly placed diplomats. Officials there wanted to know about Bengali diplomats in the Pakistan embassy, about the whereabouts of our leaders, and whether we had established a US based organization. We asked India to open its border to refugees, provide free access to Kolkata for expatriate Bangladeshis, and relax rules surrounding Indian visas for Bengalis with Pakistani passports. That night, we had another exciting discussion about setting up a government. We slightly rearranged our earlier plan. It was decided that M.A. Hassan should leave immediately for Kolkata and Agartala to make initial contacts with the political leaders who had fled from Bangladesh. He would then send the signal for me to join him and form the new government. That night, Aga Hilali, the Pakistani ambassador, came on a courtesy visit to Inayat Karim. Several of us who were eating dinner were quickly pushed into an attic room with our food. We sat there for 2 hours without making a sound so that the ambassador would not know that his Bengali colleague was harboring 3 anti-state activists in his own house. Hassan left for Kolkata and Agartala the next day as planned From Kolkata, he sent a bitter message of disappointment in the leaders and advised me not to come. Soon after, the Mujibnagar government was formed. Bengalis in the United States and Canada concentrated on the campaign for Bangladeshi recognition, on stopping military aid to Pakistan, and on freeing Sheikh Mujib. The Bangladesh League of America was established in New York under the leadership of Dr. Muhammad Alamgir, a physician, and in Chicago, the Bangladesh Defense League was created by Dr. F. R. Khan, a Bengali American architect who designed the Sears Tower in Chicago. Samsul Bari became its Secretary General. He published the first issue of the Bangladesh newsletter. I took it over from him and published the newsletter regularly from my Nashville apartment at 500 Paragon Mills Road. My apartment became a communication center. The phone rang off the hook with calls from all over North America and the United Kingdom. All Bengalis wanted daily updates on the war. Through the efforts of the Bengalis in Washington, the Bangladesh Information Center was also set up to do the lobbying in the House and the Senate. I took on the responsibility of running the Information Center for its initial period and then went on the road to organize teach-in workshops on university campuses all over the United States. During the next 9 months, we drew a very clear picture of the future of Bangladesh. We wanted to uphold democracy. We wanted to ensure the people's right to a free and fair election and to a life devoid of poverty. We dreamed of happiness and prosperity for all citizens and a nation that would stand with dignity among all other nations in the world. On December 16, 1971, Bangladesh won its war of independence. The war had taken a heavy toll. 3 million Bangladeshis had been killed and 10 million had left the country in search of safety in neighboring India. Millions more were the victims of rape and other atrocities committed by the Pakistani army. By the time the war was over, Bangladesh was a devastated country. The economy was shattered. Millions of people needed to be rehabilitated. I knew that I had to return home and participate in the work of nation building. I thought I owed it to myself. Okay, this is the end of the chapter 2. Now, chapter 3, back in Chittagong. On my return to Bangladesh in 1972, I was offered a fancy title and appointed to the government's planning commission. My job was a bore. I had nothing to do all day but read newspapers. After repeated protests to the chief of the planning commission, Nurul Islam, I resigned to become head of the economics department at Chittagong University. Chittagong University is located 20 miles east of the city of Chittagong on 1900 acres of barren hills. Built in the mid-1960s from designs by a leading architect of Bangladesh, the university looks impressive. The buildings are constructed entirely of exposed red brick with open corridors and expansive rooms. But although pleasing to the eye, these modern buildings are not at all utilitarian. When I arrived, for instance, there was a huge office for the head of each department, but no office space for the rest of the teachers. One of the first things I did as head of economics was to convert my office into a common room for my colleagues. Strangely enough, this made the staff uncomfortable. They expected the head of the department to have a big room even if others did not have any place to sit. It was a difficult time at the university. Teachers were refusing to grade examinations, accusing students of copying their answers from books and from each other. Many of the students were part of the Mukti Bahini Liberation Army. and had just returned from war. They still carried their guns and threatened to harm the teachers if exam results were not announced soon. At that time, I lived with my parents in town. My father allowed me to use his car to commute to the campus every day. Along the way, I drove through the village of Jobra, which stood between the highway and the campus. I noticed barren fields next to the village and asked a colleague, Professor H.I. Latifi, why they were not being cultivated for a winter crop. As he did not know, I proposed that we go talk to the villagers and find out the reason. It turned out that there was no water for irrigation. I thought we should do something about the unused fields. It was a shame to let the land around a university campus remain barren. If a university is a repository for knowledge, then some of this knowledge should spill over to the neighboring community. A university must not be an island where academics reach out to higher and higher levels of knowledge without sharing any of their findings. Our campus housing faced a range of hills, and from my classroom I could see a stream of boys and girls, men and cattle, walking through the campus toward the hills every morning. They carried sharp knives, and at sunset they returned with loads of twigs. It occurred to me that the university should convert these hills into fertile cropland. This would bring additional income to the university, employment to the villagers, and food to the country at large. I also grew more and more curious about the village itself. I launched a project with my students' help to survey Jobra's economy. We wanted to find out how many of the families in the village owned cultivable land and what crop they grew. How did people without any land make a living? What skills did the villagers have? What impediments did they see to improving their lives? How many families could grow food to feed themselves for the whole year? How many could not? Who were the poor? Analysis of the causes of poverty focus largely on why some countries are poor rather than on why certain segments of the population live below the poverty line. Socially conscious economists stress the absence of entitlements of the poor. What I did not know yet about hunger, but would find out over the next 22 years, was that brilliant theorists of economics do not find it worthwhile to spend time discussing issues of poverty and hunger. They believe that this will be resolved when general economic prosperity increases. These economists spend all their talents detailing the processes of development and prosperity, but rarely reflect on the origin and development of poverty and hunger. As a result, poverty continues. The 1974 famine dragged on, and the worse it became, the more agitated I grew. Unable to stand it any longer, I went to see the vice chancellor of the university, a popular social commentator and novelist. Abul Fazal was considered by many to be the conscience of the nation. He greeted me politely. "What can I do for you, Yunus?" he asked. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Mosquitoes buzzed. His orderly brought tea. "Many people are dying of starvation, yet everyone is afraid to talk about it," I responded. Abul Fazal nodded. "What do you propose?" "You are a respected man. I would ask you to make a statement to the press." "Yes, but what?" "A call to the nation and its leadership to end the famine. I am certain that all teachers on this campus will co-sign their names to your letter. if you take the lead. It would help mobilize national opinion. Yes, he sipped his tea. Yunus, he said, you write the statement and I'll sign it. I smiled. You are the writer. You will know what words to put in the statement. No, no, you do it, Yunus. You are passionate about this. You will know what to say. But I'm only an economist professor, and this document should become a rallying cry, a call to action. The more I insisted that he was the perfect man to bring national attention to bear on the famine, the more Abul Fazal encouraged me to write the letter. He pushed his point so strongly that I had no alternative but to promise I would try. That evening I wrote out a statement. The next morning I brought the draft to the Vice-Chancellor and waited while he read it. He read it. When he was finished, Abul Fazal reached for his pen and said, "Where do I sign?" I was stunned, but it is strongly worded. Maybe you want to change some things or suggest other ideas? No, 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 it is excellent, he said. And with that, he signed on the spot. I had no choice. I signed the document as well, and I made copies of it and presented it to other faculty members. Some teachers raised objections to one word or another, but because the Vice Chancellor had already signed, all of them eventually agreed to add their names to the declaration. We delivered it to the press that night, and the next day our statement was carried as a banner headline on the front pages of all the major newspapers. Our statement started a chain reaction. Other universities and public bodies that had not spoken out against the famine took up our call. I began focusing all my efforts on farming. It was clear that Bangladesh, a territory of 35 million acres with a very dense population, needed to increase its food production. We had 21 million acres available for cultivation. In the rainy season, we produced mainly rice and jute. By extending irrigation and improving water management during the dry winter season, we could increase our crops. Specialists estimated that the existing land yielded only 16% of our crop potential. I decided I would experiment on the micro level by helping the villagers of Jobra grow more food. But how would I go about it? Grow more in each crop cycle? Increase the number of crop plantings in each plot? I was not an agronomist, but I made it my business to study the low-yielding local variety of rice and more high-yielding varieties developed in the Philippines. At first, the farmers were amused by my findings, but when they saw how very serious I was, they agreed to let me plant the high-yielding rice in their fields. My students and other university teachers joined the effort as volunteers. We explained to the village farmers the importance of spacing the seedlings at regular intervals and planting in a straight line to optimize crop yields. The local newspaper published photos of us knee-deep in mud, showing local farmers how to use a string to plant rice in a straight line. Many readers were contemptuous of my hands-on approach. Despite such skepticism, I kept trying to bring the academic world and the village together by championing a university project called the Chittagong University Rural Development Project CURDP. Through the CURDP, I encouraged my students to go with me into the village and devise creative ways to improve day-to-day life there. By now, I had almost completely abandoned classical book learning in favor of hands-on person-to-person experience. Based on their experiences in the village, students could also choose a topic and write a research paper for course credit. In the winter of 1975, I focused my attention on solving the problem of irrigation to raise an extra winter crop. I knew that during monsoon season, almost every square meter of land was cultivated, including wasteland marshes which produced rice and fish. Yet all these lands remained unused during winter. Why not add a winter crop? Every day I noticed an unused deep tube well sitting idle in the middle of the uncultivated fields. It was the dry winter season, the season when the tube well should have been irrigating the land for a new crop, but nothing was being done. The tube well just sat there, brand new and unused. When I asked why the tube well was idle, I learned that the farmers were supposed to pay for the water, but that they had fought with each other over the issue of money collection during the previous dry season. Since then, they would have nothing to do with the deep tube well. This struck me as a terrible shame. In a country of famine, here was a 300-foot deep tube well, a driven well that could irrigate some 60 acres. I decided to make the tube well work again. It was not easy. Of all the modes of irrigation then available, deep tube wells were the most capital intensive. With their high operating costs, they proved highly inefficient and encouraged rampant corruption among those who dealt in fuel oil, lubricants, and spare parts. For the deep tube well to operate efficiently, it needed an efficient water distribution system. In other words, it required a large number of small farmers to implement uniform crop decisions on their fragmented holdings. These farmers also needed instruction on fertilizer use, plant production, and the repair and maintenance of the pumps. Unfortunately, although the government generously invested in modern irrigation technology, it did not provide the time, the resources, or the effort to resolve the people-centered problems such technology brought with it. Because of perennial management problems and technical breakdowns, the farmers were reluctant to reopen their tube wells. As a result, almost half the deep tube wells in Bangladesh had fallen out of use. The rusting machinery in abandoned pump houses was a testimony to yet another failure of misguided development. In Jopra, I called a meeting of local farmers and sharecroppers. I proposed an experiment in which we would all join a new type of agricultural cooperative called the Novojuk New Era tree-share farm. The landowners would contribute the use of their land during the dry season. The sharecroppers would contribute the labor, and I would contribute the cost of fuel to run the deep tube well, the seeds for high-yield crops, the fertilizer, the insecticide, and the technical know-how. In exchange, each of the three parties, farmers, sharecroppers, and myself, would share 1/3 of the harvest. At first, the villagers were suspicious of my proposal. So much ill will and disruption had built up between the well operators and the farmers that they were not ready to listen to my plan. Some argued that paying me 1/3 of the harvest would be too much. Even with my offer to bear all losses, my proposal failed to interest them. At the second meeting, 1 week later, I was able to convince them that they had nothing to lose. They would receive irrigation water, fertilizer, seeds, and insecticides without any upfront payment. They only had to agree to give me 1/3 of their harvest. The poor sharecroppers greeted my proposal with enthusiasm. The relatively well-off farmers reluctantly agreed to give it a try. This was a difficult period for me. I would often lie awake at night, anxious lest anything go wrong. Every Tuesday evening, I visited the farmers and held a formal meeting with the 4 student block leaders I had appointed, as well as my 13-man advisory team. We discussed and reviewed the problems of fertilizer, irrigation, technology, storage, transport, and marketing. The first year's efforts ended in success. The farmers were happy. They had not spent any cash and had gotten a high yield. I, however, lost 13,000 taka because some farmers gave me less than the one third they had promised. But I was still thrilled. We had managed to grow a crop where no crop had ever grown before in the dry season. The fields had been full of the emerald green of standing rice. Nothing is quite as beautiful as farmers harvesting their rice. The sight warmed my heart. But I still had misgivings. The success of our three-share experiment had highlighted a problem I had not focused on before. Once the rice was harvested, labor was needed to separate the rice from the dry straw. This mindless, boring work was offered to the cheapest day laborers, destitute women who would otherwise be reduced to begging. For hours on end, these poor women would separate the rice with their feet, holding themselves upright by gripping the tiny ledges on the wall in front of them. All day, some 25 to 30 women would perform this continuous twisting motion, wrapping the rice straws around their feet to separate the paddy. In the early morning, they would race to work, competing for the most comfortable position against the wall. What a terrible life to earn 40 cents, investing the weight of your body and the tiresome motion of your bare feet for 10 hours a day. These women, many of them widowed, divorced, or abandoned with children to feed, were poor, too poor even to be sharecroppers. They were landless and assetless, and without any hope. They were the poorest of the poor. It was clear to me that the wealthier the farmer, the more he earned from my three-share farm experiment, and the poorer the worker, the smaller was her share. Why should we be happy with your three-share farm? One woman said to me after a few weeks of threshing. We are out of work and we have nothing to show for ourselves. She was right. For the same work, a woman could earn at least 4 times more if she had the financial resources to buy the rice paddy and process it herself. The more I studied jobless poverty, the more I realized how important it was to differentiate between the really poor and the marginal farmers. International development programs in rural areas always focus on farmers and landowners. In Bangladesh, half of the total population is worse off than the marginal farmer. At the time I was studying Jopra, government bureaucrats and social scientists had not clarified who the poor in fact were. Back then, poor person could mean many things. For some, the term referred to a jobless person, an illiterate person, a landless person, or a homeless person. For others, a poor person was one who could not produce enough food to feed his or her family year round. Still others thought a poor person was one who owned a thatched house with a rotten roof, who suffered from malnutrition, or who did not send his or her children to school. Such conceptual vagueness greatly damaged our efforts to alleviate poverty. For one thing, most definitions of the poor left out women and children. In my work, I found it useful to use three broad definitions of poor to describe the situation in Bangladesh. P1, the bottom 20% of the population, hardcore poor, absolute poor. P2, bottom 35% of the population. P3, bottom 50% of the population. Within each category of poor, I often created subclassifications on the basis of region occupation, religion, ethnic background, sex, age, and so on. Occupational or regional categories may not be as quantifiable as income asset criteria, but they help us to create a multidimensional poverty matrix. Like navigation markings in unknown waters, definitions of poverty need to be distinctive and unambiguous. A definition that is not precise is as bad as no definition at all. In my definition of the poor, I would include the woman who threshed rice on our three-share farm, women who made bamboo stools, and petty traders who had to borrow at 10% per month or sometimes per week. I would also include others like them who earn so little weaving their baskets and sleeping mats that they often resorted to begging. These people had absolutely no chance of improving their economic base. Each one was stuck in poverty. My experience with jobless deep tubal convinced me to turn my focus on the landless poor. Soon, I started arguing that wherever a poverty alleviation program allowed the non-poor to be co-passengers, the poor would soon be elbowed out of the program by those who were better off. In the world of development, if one mixes the poor and the non-poor in a program, the non-poor will always drive out the poor, and the less poor will drive out the more poor, unless protective measures are instituted right at the beginning. In such cases, the non-poor reap the benefits of all that is done in the name of the poor. Alright, this is the end of the chapter 3. So I have just read chapter 2 and 3, and on the next episode I will cover the next few chapters. Alright, until then, thanks for listening.